Hello again, everyone. This is Mr. Tanner, and today for our notes, we are going to be looking at sexual reproduction. We'll be looking at how organisms make gametes, which are our sex cells, and then we'll be looking at the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, which should allow you to compare that to asexual reproduction, which we covered earlier. Let's get started. So sexual reproduction is a way of making new organisms of the same species, and it is the formation of a genetically diverse which means unique organism by fertilizing a female sex cell with a male sex cell. Now, it's important to note that even though the offspring are genetically diverse, they are very, 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 very similar. If we were to look at the DNA of humans, all humans have nearly identical DNA across every single country and continent. It's just these tiny fractions of percentages of differences that make our DNA unique. But that does lead to variation in our traits, and that's really important, as you will see later on. A sex cell is called a gamete. So when we refer to gametes, those are just sex cells. Female sex cells are called eggs or oocytes, and male sex cells are sperm in animals, and it's pollen in plants. So male sex cells are sperm, pollen, female sex cells are eggs or oocytes. Egg cells and sperm cells, which again are called gametes, it's important to remember, are the only haploid cells in our body. And what haploid means is that it only contains half of our DNA. So next, let's look at actually making those haploid cells. Haploid cells, which again, I'm going to keep writing this, it's important to know, are gametes, are made from a process called meiosis. We are going to go into the details of meiosis a lot more when we do our genetics unit, but meiosis is simply the process of creating haploid cells from the, quote, normal. Gametes are normal as well, but normal in the terms of the number of chromosomes, from the normal diploid cells in our body. So diploid cells have 100% of the genetic information, and haploid has half of the genetic information. So here's a kind of brief diagram of meiosis. It's not very detailed. Again, we'll go into more detail, but we start with a diploid cell, and it has 2 chromosomes in the nucleus. From there, it undergoes essentially mitosis. It splits into 2 more diploid cells, each with the full DNA, 2 chromosomes. And then those cells divide again, but they don't duplicate the DNA. Instead, they get 1 chromosome each. So now we have these gametes. So we start with diploid. That's from here to there. Those are diploid. And the second time, since we don't duplicate the DNA, these become haploid. In males, these are sperm cells, and all 4 of them will survive. In females, they become egg cells, and only 1 of the cells will actually survive. So the process is differentiated between males and females as well. And finally, we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of sexual reproduction, and then that should allow you to compare those advantages and disadvantages to that of asexual reproduction. We'll start with advantages. Sexual reproduction leads to offspring that have genetic diversity. And what this means is that they don't all share the same traits. There's very, very slight differences between any two offspring, and it's tiny. It's like 1 in 1,000 DNA sequences is different. It's a tiny percentage, but that difference is really, really important because this allows for populations to adapt or change over time to changing environments. Some of those different traits will be more successful in the new environment, and those organisms are more likely to survive and pass on their genes. Also, new traits allow organisms to move or expand into new environments. So even if their environment is stable, if they have new traits, they can move into new environments that are successful. Like when some grizzly bears started having mutations that caused white fur, those grizzly bears could move further north and hunt where there was more snow and ice, and their white fur allowed them to blend in. And over time, that trait was passed on, and there are some other changes, and now we have polar bears. And genetically, we can very clearly see that polar bears are very closely related to grizzly bears genetically. Now, there's some disadvantages as well, mainly around the energy requirements of sexual reproduction. So it requires courtship, which means finding a mate. And that requires a lot of energy. So one way that this needs energy is that organisms have to develop traits or characteristics that make them more likely to mate and reproduce. So elk might grow really elaborate antlers so that they can fight other males for the ability to reproduce. There's other traits like birds of paradise have really elaborate featherings and dances that help them mate, and those are all energy intensive. And then since there's diversity in those traits, some offspring will end up with traits that are actually less likely to help them survive. So that make them with traits that are less likely to be successful in their environment. So sometimes just through random mutation, an offspring ends up with a trait that makes them less likely to survive, and that means less likely to reproduce as well. That's going to do it for our notes on sexual reproduction. Hopefully you can compare that to asexual reproduction. And then next task, you're going to look at different adaptations that animals have that allow them to find a mate more easily. Thanks for watching.